Hey Cancer, welcome back, beautiful soul. I hope you're doing well and taking good care of yourself. So Cancer, as I was sitting down and connecting with your energy, something immediately caught my attention. There is a very reflective feeling surrounding this reading. It almost feels like someone is looking back at the past and seeing it very differently than they did before. And honestly, Cancer, I don't think this person expected to be thinking about you this much. But the more I sit with this energy, the more it feels like certain memories are becoming impossible for them to ignore. So let's take a look and see what the cards want to reveal. Okay, Cancer, as I sit with this energy a little longer, I have to be honest, something feels incredibly reflective here. It's almost as if someone keeps finding themselves pulled back into memories they thought they had, already moved past. Not because they're trying to revisit the past on purpose, but because certain moments keep resurfacing when they least expect it. The first card that catches my attention is the Six of Cups. And the moment it appears, I get this feeling of familiarity, a feeling of someone remembering the small things, not the dramatic moments, not the arguments, not the complicated parts, the simple things, the way you laughed, the way conversations seemed effortless, the comfort of knowing they could reach out to you and feel understood. You know, sometimes people don't realize the value of a connection while they're living inside it. They become used to its presence. They assume it will always be there in the background. And that's what this energy feels like. It feels like somebody who once viewed your presence as something ordinary, only to realize later that it was never ordinary at all. Because now I'm seeing the moon. And honestly, Cancer, this card feels emotional. Not emotional in a dramatic way. More like the kind of emotion that shows up during quiet moments. The kind that appears when the world finally settles down and there are no distractions left. This person seems to be spending a lot of time alone with their thoughts lately. There are things they are beginning to acknowledge that they may have pushed away before. Certain feelings, certain memories, certain truths. And every time they try to focus on something else, their mind somehow circles back to you. I keep hearing the phrase, "Why am I still thinking about this?" That's what feels significant. Because I don't think they expected your energy to stay with them for this long. I don't think they expected certain memories to carry this much emotional weight. Yet here they are, replaying conversations, replaying moments, wondering why those memories still feel so alive. And Cancer, what stands out to me is that many of these memories seem surprisingly ordinary. A drive somewhere, a conversation, a joke, a look, a moment of silence shared between two people, things that seemed insignificant at the time. Yet those are the exact memories returning now. Those are the memories refusing to disappear. And the more I sit with this, the more I feel like this person is beginning to understand something important. Not through logic, not through analysis, but through experience, through absence, through realizing what life feels like without the connection they once had with you. Because sometimes people only understand the role someone played in their life when that energy is no longer right in front of them. And that's where this reading starts to deepen, because now I see judgment, and the energy shifts. Something becomes impossible to ignore. It's almost like a light turning on inside someone's mind, a realization that arrives unexpectedly. A moment where they stop looking at the situation through old assumptions and begin seeing it differently. I keep getting the feeling that this person has been trying to understand why your memory continues to linger, why your presence still feels relevant, why certain emotions never completely faded. And honestly, Cancer, I don't think they've fully answered those questions yet. I think they're still exploring them, still uncovering them, still trying to understand why your energy feels different from so many other experiences they've had. What I find interesting is that the more they look back, the less focused they become on what went wrong. Instead, they seem increasingly focused on what was right, the peace, the comfort, the emotional safety, the feeling that they could simply be themselves. And for someone here, that realization feels surprisingly powerful. Because once a person starts seeing a connection through that lens, it becomes very difficult to pretend it didn't matter. And I keep feeling like there are still layers beneath the surface that haven't fully revealed themselves yet. Because while this person is remembering the connection, they're also beginning to examine the choices that created distance in the first place. And Cancer, that feels like the part of the story that's only beginning to unfold. I have to be honest, Cancer, the energy starts getting heavier here. Not because this person stopped caring. Quite the opposite. It feels heavy because they're beginning to understand parts of themselves they spent a very long time avoiding. The moon shows up again, and the moment I see it, I get this image of someone standing alone with thoughts they've been running from for years. You know how some people become experts at distraction? Keeping busy, changing the subject, focusing on work, focusing on everyone else's problems, doing anything except sitting quietly with their own emotions. That's what this feels like. There was a period where this person convinced themselves that distance was easier than vulnerability, easier than honesty, easier than admitting that someone had reached places inside them they weren't prepared to explore. Because what keeps coming through is fear. Not fear of the connection itself, fear of what the connection required. The closer they felt to you, the more exposed they felt. And for someone carrying old wounds, exposure can feel dangerous. It can feel like standing in front of someone without any armor. No defenses, no walls, no carefully crafted image, just the truth. And I don't think this person knew what to do with that. So instead of leaning closer, they pulled away. Instead of speaking openly, they became quieter. Instead of asking for understanding, they created distance. Okay. This is interesting because the more I sit with this energy, the less it feels intentional. It doesn't feel like someone waking up one morning and deciding to hurt another person. It feels more like somebody acting from old survival patterns. Patterns they learned long before you entered their life. Patterns that taught them that emotions should be hidden, that weakness should never be shown, that needing someone creates risk. And those beliefs followed them into this connection. The Five of Cups appears, and immediately I feel regret. Not dramatic regret, not loud regret, the kind that arrives slowly, the kind that sneaks into ordinary moments, looking at an old photo, hearing a familiar song, passing a place connected to a memory, and suddenly realizing something important is missing. There is a growing awareness here that their choices affected someone who genuinely cared, someone who wasn't asking them to be perfect, someone who wasn't demanding impossible things from them, someone who simply wanted honesty. And Cancer, I feel like that's what keeps replaying inside this person's mind. The moments where things could have gone differently. The conversations they avoided, the words they never said, the opportunities they allowed to pass by. Because regret has a way of revisiting unfinished chapters, especially when the heart still has questions. And honestly, I think there are many questions this person is carrying right now. Questions about themselves. Questions about their reactions. Questions about why they kept choosing silence when part of them wanted connection. Why they kept retreating when part of them wanted closeness. Why they kept pushing away something that brought them comfort. The Nine of Swords appears, and I can almost feel how restless this energy is becoming. This doesn't feel peaceful. This doesn't feel resolved. It feels like someone lying awake longer than they should. Someone replaying situations over and over again. Trying to understand where things changed. Trying to understand why they handled things the way they did. And the hardest part seems to be recognizing the impact their actions may have had on you. Because for a long time, I think this person focused mainly on their own fears, their own confusion, their own struggles. But now there is a shift happening. Now they're beginning to see another perspective. They're beginning to realize that while they were protecting themselves, someone else may have been left carrying unanswered questions. Someone else may have been left wondering what happened. Someone else may have felt the distance without understanding why it appeared. And I think that's difficult for them to sit with. Not because they want sympathy, not because they want excuses, but because awareness changes everything. Once you see something clearly, it's very difficult to go back to the version of the story you told yourself before. And Cancer, there is something else emerging underneath all of this. Something quieter, something they haven't fully faced yet. Because beneath the regret, beneath the fear, beneath the sleepless thoughts, there seems to be a realization forming. A realization about what this connection actually meant to them. And honestly, I don't think they've reached the end of that realization yet. I think they're only beginning to understand it. And the deeper they look, the more difficult it becomes to ignore what their heart has been trying to tell them all along. Okay, something is shifting here. Not outside of this person, inside of them. Because as I sit with this energy, I get the feeling that they're starting to look at their life from a completely different perspective. And honestly, Cancer, I don't think they expected this change to happen. For a long time, it feels like they were operating on autopilot, following familiar patterns, listening to familiar voices, making decisions based on what seemed practical at the time. But now I'm seeing justice appear in the spread, and the atmosphere changes immediately. It's almost like someone standing in front of a mirror they can no longer avoid. A mirror that reflects not only what happened, but why it happened. And I have to be honest, some of the answers they're finding are uncomfortable. Because this person is beginning to recognize how much influence certain people and circumstances had over their choices. Not because they were forced. Not because they had no free will, but because they were allowing outside noise to become louder than their own inner. truth. I keep feeling like there were opinions involved, expectations, pressures. People who always seem to have something to say about what was right, what was wrong, what made sense, what didn't. And somewhere along the way, this person became disconnected from what they genuinely felt. Instead of asking themselves what brought them peace, they focused on what brought them approval. Instead of following their heart, they followed what appeared safer. But safety and happiness are not always the same thing, and that's becoming impossible for them to ignore now. Because the more they evaluate their choices, the more they realize certain things didn't bring the fulfillment they thought they would. What once looked appealing now feels empty. What once felt important now feels insignificant. What once seemed worth sacrificing everything for no longer carries the same weight. And Cancer, that's where your energy begins showing up very strongly again. The Empress appears. The moment this card enters the reading, I feel a softness that hasn't been present for a while. Not weakness, not dependency, just genuine care. The kind of energy that doesn't need to prove itself. The kind of energy that simply exists and makes people feel safe. I keep getting this feeling that this person is comparing experiences, comparing interactions, comparing how they felt around certain people versus how they felt around you. And the differences are becoming harder to ignore. Because with you, there seems to have been a sense of acceptance, a sense of being understood, a sense that they didn't have to constantly perform or protect themselves. You know, sometimes people don't fully appreciate emotional safety until they've spent time in environments where it doesn't exist. And that's exactly what this feels like. The more distance there is between the present moment and the past, the clearer certain truths become. The Seven of Pentacles comes forward, and immediately I see someone reflecting, not rushing, not reacting, just observing, looking at everything they've invested their time, energy, and emotions into, looking at the outcomes, looking at the results, and asking themselves a very simple question: was it worth it? I think that's what keeps echoing through this energy. Not anger, not blame, just evaluation, a very honest evaluation. And Cancer, some of the answers they're finding are surprising even to them, because the picture they're seeing now doesn't match the picture they believed before. Certain people appear differently. Certain situations appear differently. Even their own actions appear differently. It's almost like a fog is lifting, like details that were once hidden are slowly coming into focus. And the closer they look, the more they begin recognizing something that has been sitting quietly beneath the surface all along. Your consistency, your kindness, your patience. Not because you're perfect, not because you never made mistakes, but because your intentions were genuine. And that's becoming increasingly obvious to this person. I keep hearing the phrase, "I didn't see it clearly before." That's exactly how this energy feels. Not sudden enlightenment, not some dramatic revelation, just truth arriving one piece at a time, slowly, patiently, until it can no longer be denied. And what fascinates me is that this realization seems to be creating another question, a bigger question, because once someone finally understands what mattered, they inevitably start wondering what can still be done about it. And honestly, that feels like the direction this energy is beginning to move toward now. Okay, something feels different now. Not lighter exactly, just clearer. Because the energy I'm picking up on no longer feels trapped inside someone's head. It feels like it's beginning to move toward action. And I have to be honest, Cancer, that movement is making this person nervous, very nervous. The Eight of Wands comes into view, and immediately I get the sense that silence is becoming harder for them to maintain. For a while, they may have convinced themselves that keeping everything inside was the safest option. If they stayed quiet, they wouldn't have to risk rejection. If they stayed quiet, they wouldn't have to explain themselves. If they stayed quiet, they wouldn't have to face the possibility that things had changed. But something about that strategy isn't working anymore. Because every unanswered thought seems to be creating another one. Every unfinished conversation seems to be demanding attention. And this person is beginning to realize that no amount of waiting is making those feelings disappear. You know, I keep seeing somebody picking up their phone and putting it back down, opening a message and deleting it, thinking about reaching out, then talking themselves out of it. Not because they don't care, because they care too much. That's what feels important. This isn't the energy of someone who feels indifferent. This is the energy of someone who has spent so much time thinking about what to say that they no longer know where to begin. And Cancer, there seems to be one fear that rises above all the others. The fear that you've already moved on. The fear that while they were trying to figure themselves out, life kept moving forward. The fear that the opportunity they once assumed would always be there may no longer exist in the same way. I keep hearing this question repeating inside their energy. What if it's too late? Not as a certainty, not as a prediction, just as a fear, a very human fear. Because once someone starts understanding the value of a connection, they inevitably start wondering whether that connection still has room for them. The Knight of Cups appears, and immediately I feel emotion that has been waiting for a long time to be expressed. Not perfectly, not eloquently, just honestly. This person feels like they're carrying words they've never fully spoken, explanations they never gave, truths they never shared. And the strange thing is that some of those truths aren't even about you. They're about themselves, about the confusion they were experiencing, about the fears they didn't know how to communicate, about the struggles they tried to handle alone. I keep getting this feeling that there were moments when they wanted to explain what was happening internally, but they couldn't find the language for it. So instead of speaking, they withdrew. Instead of clarifying, they disappeared into their own thoughts. And now they're realizing that silence created its own story, a story that may not have reflected what was actually happening inside them. Okay, this energy is becoming emotional because the more they think about contacting you, the more they start imagining the conversation itself. What would they say first? Would they apologize? Would they explain? Would they ask questions? Would they simply tell you they've been thinking about you? It's almost like they're rehearsing conversations in their mind, testing different versions, trying to find the right words, trying to find a way to bridge a distance that suddenly feels much larger than they expected. And Cancer, what stands out is that this isn't only about getting a response from you. It's also about finally being honest with themselves, because some truths become very difficult to ignore once they reach the surface. The Strength card appears and the atmosphere shifts again. Not dramatic, not chaotic, steady, intentional, because courage isn't always loud. Sometimes courage looks like admitting something you've been avoiding. Sometimes courage looks like facing a conversation you've postponed. Sometimes courage looks like allowing yourself to be seen without all the defenses you've relied on for years. And that's what feels significant here. This person seems to understand that reaching out requires more than words. It requires vulnerability. It requires accountability. It requires accepting that they cannot control how another person responds. And honestly, that may be the hardest part for them, because there is no guarantee. No script, no perfect outcome, only honesty, only sincerity, only the willingness to step forward despite uncertainty. What fascinates me is that the closer they get to this realization, the less focused they become on protecting themselves. Their attention keeps returning to something else. A feeling that there are things that deserve to be said, things that deserve acknowledgement, things that have remained unfinished for far too long. And Cancer, as I sit with this energy, it feels like those unspoken words are getting closer and closer to the surface, closer than they've been in a very long time. Okay, I have to be honest, Cancer. The energy here feels very different from where this story began. Not because everything has suddenly become simple, not because every question has already been answered, but because something inside this person is no longer resisting the truth the way they once did. And the first thing that catches my attention is the Ace of Cups. The moment this card appears, I get this overwhelming feeling of emotional openness. Not perfection, not fantasy, just openness. It's almost like someone standing at the edge of a new chapter and realizing they don't want to carry the same fears into it. Because for so long, it feels like they were trying to protect themselves from uncertainty, protect themselves from disappointment, protect themselves from vulnerability. Yet in doing so, they may have also protected themselves from the very connection they wanted most. And that realization feels important. Because this person seems to understand now that some opportunities are not meant to be managed through distance. Some things require presence. Some things require honesty. Some things require showing up fully instead of hiding behind uncertainty. You know, I keep getting this image of someone looking at the road behind them and realizing how much energy was spent avoiding what their heart already knew. And I don't feel judgment in that realization. I feel acceptance. I feel maturity. I feel somebody finally becoming willing to acknowledge what matters. The Ten of Cups comes into view, and immediately I feel this shift towards something deeper than attraction, deeper than curiosity, deeper than temporary emotion. Because what this person seems to be longing for isn't excitement alone. It's peace. It's consistency. It's the feeling of building something meaningful with someone who genuinely understands them. And Cancer, every time I sit with your energy inside this reading, that sense of emotional safety keeps returning. Not because you always had all the answers, not because everything between you was easy, but because there was authenticity there. There was something real there, something that didn't require constant performance, something that didn't require masks. And honestly, I think this person is beginning to understand how rare that actually is. because life has a way of teaching people the difference between what looks valuable and what truly is valuable. Sometimes that lesson arrives quickly. Sometimes it takes much longer, but eventually clarity arrives, and that's exactly what this feels like. Justice appears again, and I have to be honest, this doesn't feel like punishment. It feels like accountability. It feels like somebody reaching a point where they no longer want to avoid responsibility for the choices they've made. Because there is a difference between regret and accountability. Regret looks backward. Accountability moves forward. Regret says, I wish things had been different. Accountability says, what can I do now? And that's where this person's energy seems to be shifting. They're beginning to understand that if something matters, it deserves honesty. If something matters, it deserves effort. If something matters, it deserves clarity. I keep feeling this desire to make things right, not because they're trying to erase the past, not because they're trying to pretend mistakes never happened, but because they're finally willing to acknowledge those mistakes openly. And Cancer, that willingness feels significant because it requires humility. It requires growth. It requires looking directly at uncomfortable truths and refusing to run from them. The Emperor appears, and the entire atmosphere changes once again. The uncertainty that surrounded this person for so long seems quieter now. Not completely gone, just quieter, because there is a growing sense of determination here, a growing sense of wanting actions to match intentions, wanting words to match feelings, wanting reality to reflect what has been happening internally. I keep hearing the phrase, no more hiding, and honestly, that feels powerful, because this person seems tired of living in half measures, tired of standing between two choices, tired of carrying thoughts they never express, tired of allowing fear to make decisions for them. What fascinates me most is that this doesn't feel rushed. It doesn't feel impulsive. It feels deliberate, like somebody carefully building the courage to move forward in a way they couldn't before. And Cancer, as I sit with these final cards, I don't see someone focused on repeating old patterns. I see someone focused on understanding them. I see someone beginning to recognize what deserves their energy, what deserves their effort, what deserves their honesty. And the deeper they move into that realization, the more it feels like a new door is quietly beginning to open. Not because the story is finished, but because it may finally be ready to move into a very different chapter than the one that came before. And Cancer, I have to be honest, this reading feels less like an ending and more like a moment of understanding. A moment where certain pieces are finally starting to fall into place. No matter where you currently stand in this story, remember that your value has never depended on whether someone else was able to recognize it right away. Sometimes people need time to see clearly. Sometimes they need experience to understand what truly matters. For now, focus on yourself. Focus on your peace. Focus on the life you're continuing to build, one step at a time. Thank you so much for being here and sharing your energy with me. It truly means more than you know. If this reading resonated, feel free to subscribe, and join our growing family here on the channel. And until we meet again, Cancer, take care of your heart, trust your intuition, and keep moving toward everything that feels genuine, healthy, and aligned for you. I'll see you in the next one. Bye for now.